Roughly 4,700 years ago, on the storm-beaten western edge of Patagonia, a man known to science as Ayayema 460 lived and died near the fjords that now cut into Chile's coast. His bones preserve the genetic legacy of one of the most important turning points in human history, the final chapter of the first peopling of the Americas. Ancient DNA reveals that A460 was part of a seafaring population descended from the earliest coastal explorers who left Asia around 20,000 years ago, split from their northern relatives in California by 13,000 years ago, and reached the southern tip of the continent by 6,000 years ago. In his genome lies evidence of both this long maritime odyssey and traces of an even older lineage, known as Population Y, that had mixed with his ancestors along the way. On an island battered by cold Pacific winds, a small cave holds one of the most surprising human stories ever uncovered in the Americas. The site is known as Cueva Ayayema on Isla Madre de Dios in the Magallanes region of Chilean Patagonia. Here, archaeologists discovered the incomplete but well-preserved bones of a man who lived about 4,500 years ago. This individual, labeled as Ayayema in the scientific literature and known as Specimen 460 in genomic datasets, has become one of the most revealing ancient genomes ever sequenced from South America. His DNA has rewritten what we thought we knew about the first peoples of the continent and their links to the Australasians of island Southeast Asia. The Ayayema man's genome was first published in the landmark study Early Human Dispersals Within the Americas in the journal Science. The researchers sequenced ancient human genomes from across the length of the Americas, including sites in Alaska, California, Brazil, and Chile. Their goal was to reconstruct the journey of the first people who entered the New World after the initial migration from Northeast Asia. What they found would transform the story of human dispersal on the planet's farthest shore. The new genomic reanalysis that compared hundreds of ancient and modern genomes across the Americas found something even more intriguing. Ayayema man possessed about 3% of a deep, non-American ancestry, most closely related to modern Papuans and Andaman Islanders. This component, first detected in ancient Brazilian and Amazonian individuals, is called Population Y, a mysterious ancestral Asian lineage that diverged from the main ancestral Native American line more than 30,000 years ago. Its presence in Ayayema means that the southern coastal migrants did not travel in genetic isolation. Somewhere between Mesoamerica and southern Chile, the mariners absorbed a small remnant of this older Population Y group, perhaps along the coasts of Ecuador or northern Peru, where the Australasian-like signal remains strongest in early Holocene skeletons. By the time their descendants reached Patagonia, this ancestry had been diluted to a faint trace, yet it persisted in measurable form for thousands of years. While the northern genomes largely fit expectations, descendants of Siberian settlers who had crossed Beringia, Ayayema's genome did not. His ancestry was not primarily related to later Native American populations that spread from Mesoamerica. Instead, it carried a much older and more mysterious signal that connected him with the earliest inhabitants of South America, those from Lagoa Santa in Brazil, who lived around 10,000 years ago, and whose skeletal remains had long puzzled scientists with their unusual features. Radiocarbon dating placed the Ayayema man between 5,308 and 4,933 years before present. He was a strong adult, between 35 and 50 years of age, and lived as a hunter-gatherer in a maritime landscape abundant with fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. His skeleton was found near the cave's surface, well preserved despite the harsh conditions of the southern archipelago. The region he called home was one of the most challenging on Earth, a labyrinth of fjords, rain, and wind, where the Pacific Ocean crashes into the Andes. By about 7,000 years ago, people in this region had developed a fully maritime lifestyle. They built canoes from hollowed logs, hunted sea lions, and gathered mussels along rocky coasts. The Ayayema man was part of this early wave of seafaring hunter-gatherers who had mastered the cold southern waters, thousands of years before the rise of agriculture or civilization in the Andes. To understand how his ancestors came to live so far south, one must trace the human story back 20,000 years. During the height of the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets covered northern latitudes, a small human population survived in Beringia, the now submerged land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. This Beringian population was isolated for thousands of years, and from it descended the peoples who would eventually populate the Americas. Two main paths opened after the glaciers began to melt, one through the continental interior, following river valleys and ice-free corridors, and another along the Pacific coast, where the sea teemed with kelp, shellfish, and driftwood for fuel and rafts. The coastal route offered a continuous ecological highway stretching from Northeast Asia to the tip of South America. It was along this coastal corridor that the ancestors of Ayayema traveled. Genetically, these early coastal peoples carried a mitochondrial lineage known as D4H3A, one of the oldest branches of Native American ancestry. DNA from sites in Alaska and California dating to 10,000 years ago, and from Monte Verde in southern Chile dating to about 14,000 years ago, confirms their presence along the Pacific margin. Around 13 to 14,000 years ago, this lineage split into two branches, one that remained in the north, around California and the Pacific Northwest, and another that continued southward, reaching Peru, Chile, and eventually Patagonia. The southern branch carried with it both a deep genetic connection to its northern cousins and, as we now know from Ayayema, traces of an even older ancestry from Asia that predated the migration into the Americas. By 7,000 years ago, the descendants of this southern branch had reached Patagonia's coasts. Meanwhile, a woman from Punta Santa Ana, discovered on the Strait of Magellan, lived in a marine environment and left behind a genome that also carried a small proportion of Australasian-related ancestry, about 3%. 2,000 years later, Ayayema A460 was born into the same lineage. He represents the next stage in this coastal tradition, showing genetic continuity with Punta Santa Ana and with later maritime peoples such as the Kawesca and Yamana, who lived in the Chilean fjords and islands until recent times. When researchers compared Ayayema's genome to those of other ancient and modern peoples, they found something astonishing. In complex trees of shared ancestry, Ayayema grouped not with later Andean or Mesoamerican populations, but with the much older Lagoa Santa individuals from Brazil. Both shared a faint yet statistically clear genetic link to populations thousands of kilometers away in Australasia, including the modern Papuans of New Guinea and the indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands. This signal, representing roughly 2 to 3% of the genome, meant that the earliest South Americans carried ancestry from an ancient lineage related to the people of island Southeast Asia. The finding was remarkable, not because the percentage was large, but because of what it implied. It suggested that the earliest settlers of South America descended from a population that had already mixed with peoples carrying Australasian-like DNA before entering the Americas. These early migrants likely originated somewhere along the coasts of Southeast Asia or the Western Pacific, where contact between Denisovan-related and modern human populations occurred during the late Pleistocene. This ancient mixture traveled with them across Asia, through Beringia, and down the Pacific coast, surviving in the genomes of their descendants even after tens of millennia. Ayayema's DNA also carried an elevated amount of Denisovan-related sequences, a finding that further strengthens the link between early South Americans and island Southeast Asian populations. Denisovans were an extinct branch of archaic humans, a sister group to Neanderthals, who lived across Asia and left a genetic legacy in the peoples of Oceania and parts of East Asia. The overlap of Denisovan and Australasian ancestry in Ayayema implies that his ancestors belonged to a coastal population that was already genetically complex long before it reached the New World. The discovery of this dual ancestry in Patagonia forces a re-evaluation of the human story in the Americas. For decades, researchers assumed that the continent was populated by a single migration of Siberian hunter-gatherers who moved south after the ice sheets receded. The new evidence shows that the process was far more intricate. There were multiple pulses of migration and mixing, some carrying lineages enriched with Australasian and Denisovan ancestry. These groups did not all follow the same route or reach the same destinations. Some spread into the Amazon basin and eastern Brazil, while others, like the ancestors of Ayayema, traveled along the Pacific edge. The presence of a faint Australasian genetic component in both Amazonian and Patagonian individuals, but not in most northern populations, indicates that this signal came from an early branch that had split from the main migration soon after entering the continent. The inland and eastern groups, such as the Surui and Caritiana, retained more of this ancient component, while western Andean populations later received new gene flow from Mesoamerican-related peoples, which diluted the older ancestry. Patagonia, however, was a refuge. Its isolation allowed the older lineage to survive largely intact. The genomes of Ayayema and Punta Santa Ana show almost no trace of the later Mesoamerican influx, confirming that their people had remained separate for thousands of years. In 2021, a more detailed reanalysis of the same data using expanded genetic models refined this picture. When Australasian references such as the Onge and Papuans were included, both Ayayema and Punta Santa Ana showed an estimated 3% of population Y ancestry. Population Y is the term geneticists use for the ancient, unsampled lineage distantly related to modern Australasian peoples. It represents one of the oldest branches of the human tree in the Americas, possibly entering the continent through an earlier or separate migration more than 20,000 years ago. This faint genetic echo revealed that the ancestors of Ayayema were part of a mixed population that carried both the coastal D4H3A lineage from Beringia and a remnant of the older population Y heritage. The admixture was not a local Patagonian event, but a much earlier one, probably occurring in tropical South America as the first settlers moved down the coast. As these groups dispersed into different ecological zones, small degrees of population Y ancestry were retained in some communities and lost in others. By the time Ayayema lived, this ancestry survived as a trace signal, like a whisper from an earlier world. It connected him to the first humans who entered the continent roughly 20,000 years ago. The migration that led to Ayayema's people was therefore not a single journey, but a sequence of expansions and isolations stretching across 10 millennia. The first step began in Asia, where populations already admixed with Denisovans followed coastlines through Japan, the Kuril Islands, and down the Beringian shore. From there, they entered the Americas between 18 and 16,000 years ago, hugging the Pacific coast. Around 14,000 years ago, their descendants reached the shores of California. At that point, genetic and archaeological evidence shows a divergence. The northern branch remained in the Pacific Northwest and developed its own regional traditions, while the southern branch moved rapidly towards Central and South America. By 13,000 years ago, this southern stream reached Peru and Chile, establishing the genetic and cultural foundations of the first coastal South Americans. Over the next 7,000 years, they expanded through the Chilean archipelago, ultimately reaching Patagonia around 6,000 years ago, where Ayayema's ancestors settled permanently. The continuity between early and later Patagonian genomes confirms that these migrants did not vanish. Instead, they became the ancestors of the historic maritime peoples of the region, the Kawesca and Yamana, who lived by fishing, sealing and canoeing through the labyrinth of islands. Their genetic profiles show direct descent from the Ayayema lineage, with the same small proportion of Australasian ancestry preserved like a thread across time. Even after thousands of years, this signature remained stable. In the Kawesca genomes, from 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, the Australasian proportion is around 3.5%, and in the Yamana genomes from about 1,000 years ago, it rises to as much as 5.5%, the highest ever recorded in the Americas. Such persistence suggests long-term isolation and population continuity, not replacement. The meaning of this genetic continuity is profound. It shows that the people of Patagonia were the living descendants of the first coastal explorers to enter the continent, maintaining their ancestral heritage through millennia of environmental change and cultural adaptation. Ayayema A460 thus represents a direct biological bridge between the earliest wave of settlers and the historic maritime cultures that survived into modern times. His genome links the far south of the Americas to a web of ancient connections stretching across the Pacific and into the deep human past. The story told by Ayayema's DNA is not one of a simple migration, but of movement, contact, and adaptation over immense distances. His ancestors once walked tropical shores in Asia, where they mingled with other human lineages, and their descendants later navigated the ice-strewn channels of Patagonia. The genetic legacy that binds these distant worlds reveals that humanity's dispersal across the globe was not a single exodus, but a mosaic of intertwined journeys. The presence of population Y ancestry in Patagonia demonstrates that even the most remote human groups preserved traces of ancient interactions that occurred tens of thousands of years earlier. Today, the Ayayema genome serves as a time capsule of that forgotten era. Within its sequence lies the record of two great events: the first entry of humans into the Americas roughly 20,000 years ago, and the later arrival of maritime peoples in Patagonia about 6,000 years ago. The faint Australasian and Denisovan signals in his DNA are not anomalies. They are living fossils of the earliest chapters of human expansion. They prove that by the time the glaciers retreated, our species had already circled much of the Pacific Rim, leaving fragments of shared ancestry scattered from island Southeast Asia to the southernmost tip of the New World. Ayayema's discovery reveals that the peopling of the Americas was part of a global process that connected continents long before recorded history. The small percentage of population Y ancestry found in his genome, about 3%, tells of a deep-time contact zone where different human groups once met and mingled. His ancestors carried that legacy southward, preserving it through thousands of generations until it was finally recovered from his bones by modern science. In his DNA, the journey of humanity across the world becomes visible, a journey that began in Asia 20,000 years ago, splitting California 13,000 years ago, and culminated in Patagonia 6,000 years ago, where the winds of the Pacific still echo over the sea caves of Isla Madre de Dios. The Ayayema man's life ended in obscurity, but his genetic story stretches across epochs. He was the heir of explorers who followed the ocean's edge from the Bering Strait to the Strait of Magellan. His people founded the maritime tradition of southern South America and left their mark on all who came after. In the isolation of the fjords, far from the centers of later civilizations, they preserved a lineage that links the first Americans to the ancient peoples of Australasia. The Ayayema genome is not only a key to the prehistory of Patagonia, it is a monument to the endurance and interconnectedness of humankind.